legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com. And I'm your host, Greg Moffat. The title of today's video is COVID-19, War on Humanity by Non-Human Forces. Subtitle is Beyond Three Dimensions, Beyond Five Senses, Beyond Imagination. And all of this is alluding to the coronavirus crisis, pandemic response that we've been living through now for 2+ years to a greater or lesser extent globally. And the idea, the gathering idea that there's something else going on with all of this. That is to say that any attempt to understand what's been happening through a purely mainstream materialist point of view, worldview, way of thinking, it will inevitably fail. So many people have been so confused by what's happening. So many things don't add up. They don't make sense. And this has led some people to question whether there's something going on beyond the obvious narrative. Now, I'm not just talking about in the realms of so-called conspiracy theory here, behind the scenes action of no doubt of which there is a great deal. I'm talking about, as my title alludes to, beyond the reality, the everyday reality that we perceive with our five senses and beyond the three-dimensional world that we all appear to inhabit. Specifically, that there is some kind of non-material dimension to what's happening in the world at the moment. This could involve something interdimensional, something off-world, occult forces, we just don't know. But increasing numbers of writers and researchers have been moving in this direction. Some have been saying from the start that there was something, very inhuman and sinister about all this. But gathering numbers of fairly ordinary observers are just saying this, this isn't right. There's got to be something else going on here. They've looked to alternative viewpoints in the alternative media, and a lot of those, again, coming from a materialist point of view, mainstream alternative, if I can put it like that, point of view, they're not satisfactory. They don't add up to an explanation. So I'm not pretending that I've got an explanation today, but what I'm going to do is just present some resources, from some writers, some thinkers, old and current, past, present, some viewpoints, ways of looking at the world and reality that might help us all begin to get to grips with this in a different way. Think about it differently, because certainly we see the mainstream narrative around this, and I'm back to the mainstream now. For example, on the nightly news and in the media online, the pandemic story beginning to unravel. And that's interesting in itself. But when we look at what might be going on in the deeper, darker dimensions of all this, then what's happening now is just part of a long ongoing process that is far from over. Now, prior to the pandemic kicking off, many people were saying, myself included, that we as a species appear to be collectively going insane. We were certainly exhibiting self-harming behaviors and possibly were on the road to some kind of collective suicide. And all of that was kicked up into high gear when, of course, the pandemic hit. Whatever you think about the origins of any of that, we can set that aside for a moment, because clearly something's going on here. There's some things are happening in the world. You can't just say that none of what's going on in any dimension of reality, 3D or otherwise, amounts to nothing really. The thing for me, and I've always accepted or for a long time intuited and instinctively understood that there's more to reality than meets our five senses and more to the three dimensions that we perceive. That there is a non-material dimension to reality, call it spiritual, call it the underlying field of consciousness, call it anything you like. But it's simply that what the reality that you and I are currently sharing now isn't all there is. So that inevitably played into my thinking when the pandemic came along. The thing for me in all of this that really got me thinking about deeper, darker dimensions was basically the aspect of this involving cruelty to children. When I saw what children across the world were being put through in the name of the pandemic response, it got to a point where it was just starting to look not just even cruel, but sadistic. And I remember late one night thinking, the people, the creatures allowing this to happen or causing this to happen, they cannot be fully human. Maybe they're not even human at all. Because in my shows over the years, I've looked at the possibility that not everyone that you meet, not every creature you meet that looks a bit like your eye is necessarily human, and there may in fact be many more bodies on this earth than there are souls. Now, so I began to explore this in let's say the work of writers and thinkers out there, and one of the first things that came to my attention thinking about this was this book, The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events. This is by Jane Roberts, and she's channeled an entity called Seth. The fact that this is a channeled work, if you think that's all hokum, it doesn't really matter either way. What counts is what's actually written within the pages. And this, particularly early stages of the book, had some real eye-opening moments for me. And this dates back to 1979, something like that. If we just open up the book and go to the information about the very early stages in the contents section, you'll see part 1, the events of nature, quote unquote, epidemics and natural disasters. Now the idea there essentially, it's kind of a Jungian idea in a way, that the collective unconscious of our species can bring about physical events in the so-called real world. And Jung's idea was that anything that, I'm just paraphrasing him now, anything that's kind of suppressed within the psyche, individual or collective, manifests itself in the world as an event. You can think about this, anything that's denied, anything that wants to come out, that you try to prevent from coming out, will appear in some other way. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It takes tremendous effort and eventually it'll pop up somewhere else. So, and that plays into the idea, when we think about the pandemic, that as within, so without, that the events we're seeing in the world now are somehow a manifestation of our collective unconscious. Now that only partly plays into my idea about non-human entities being part of this, but it's still very relevant, I think, to the overall picture. And this is just the beginning of one way of thinking about events in the world. You see it at a very physical level. You see people becoming, their bodies becoming sick when their minds are troubled. The mind suffers, the body cries out, as I've said before many times. So yeah, the individual, the nature of mass events, very interesting material, especially the first section of the book. Now that information also plays somewhat into the Human Consciousness Project, which I became aware of around the time of 9/11. You can just look that up. And that's a project that charts, uses random number generators to chart fluctuations in these numbers and tries to map them onto corresponding world events. And around the time of 9/11, the Human Consciousness Project claimed to have seen a huge spike in their measurements that could be mapped onto the events of 9/11, just prior to. A lot of people are skeptical about that. I just throw it out there because it's relevant and possibly interesting. And this also has some relevance to Cliff High's WebBot project. Again, a lot of people really rate the work of Cliff High. I don't think the WebBot project has really got much of a track record of accurate predictions, but it's just relevant and potentially interesting. Now, seminal writer and thinker from the late 19th, early 20th century is Rudolf Steiner. And I've noticed, certainly had a great interest in his work, a great resurgence in interest in his work within the last couple of years. And I've noticed that popping up everywhere. Lots of people of my acquaintance, associates, friends have all been beginning to look at Steiner's work in the light of, recent events. And Steiner was the founder of anthroposophy. Now, you don't need to know anything about Rudolf Steiner or anthroposophy to look at some of this material. It speaks for itself, but you might want to get, just maybe look up Wikipedia, get the basics if you're going to plunge into this. Steiner's, one of his key things was what he called spiritual science. Does what it says on the tin. The idea that we are not purely scientific materialistic beings, clearly. We're not purely spiritual beings either, because this manifestation on this plane is important. We shouldn't deny the importance of earthly incarnation. And his vision of the future was, and this is something I've championed a lot, legalizefreedom.com with various guests over the years, is a future where these different aspects of the human being will be taken into account and given equal importance, or certainly, some sort of balance, because our current global society is very out of balance in favor of scientific materialism. So when I look to a work of Steiner to find out, some of the ideas that might help us inform what's going on at the minute, a book that came to my attention was this small book, The Coronavirus Pandemic, Anthroposophical Perspectives, by a German writer, Judith von Halle. Fascinating little book, and this was written very early on in the pandemic, so it's a very early response to what's going on. And it basically consists of just two very long letters to other anthroposophists, basically, who wanted to know what she thought about what was happening. So in some ways, it's very incomplete. But again, fascinating insights. And this led me on to, I thought about interviewing her, but this is a translation from German into English. So I thought perhaps she might not be the best person to go to. So what I ended up doing was I'd also stumbled upon a anthroposophical blog called Anthropopper. And the gentleman who writes that is called Jeremy Smith. So I eventually ended up talking with him about Steiner's work, Anthroposophy, and the content of this book, which he's also read, and his excellent blog, Anthropopper. So you'll find our interview, legalize-freedom.com. So continuing with Steiner's work, I stumbled upon, as I was going through some online talks, Steiner's work, his lectures were never really recorded in audio, but many people have read his lectures and done very nice versions, which are available online. And I stumbled upon one which was basically a reading of another short book from the work of Rudolf Steiner on epidemics, spiritual perspectives. Now, when I listened to this for the first time just a few months ago, I was stopped in my tracks more than once. Bearing in mind this material is like 100 plus years old, thinking, wow, did he just say that? And if you look at the list of subtopics here on the front, you're probably not sure if you can read that on screen, so I'll read out for you. Protective measures, prevention, diseases of civilization, susceptibility, fear of infection, bacteria, vaccination, infectious diseases, karmic influences, childhood illnesses, epidemics, and parasites. And the section on vaccination is probably the one that's been most quoted and most used in memes across the internet since Steiner's work started to bubble up more into the popular consciousness. So this book, widely available, but in the information below this video, you'll also find a link to the online reading of this, which will get you started in a quick and easy way into Steiner's interpretation of all this. Much more recently released, I should say, is a more complete gathering together summation of Steiner's pronouncements on epidemics and whatnot, all the subtopics from the previous book. And this one's called Viral Illness and Epidemics in the Work of Rudolf Steiner. And this purports to bring everything he said on the subject together in one volume, a little bit thicker than the previous one. And again, this is a goldmine of thought-provoking material from a spiritual, scientific perspective, informing and illuminating world events in a sometimes very, very stunning and startling fashion. Also related and based on the work of Rudolf Steiner is the writings of the late Paul Emerson, which were drawn to my attention by my friend and colleague Kingsley Dennis. Emerson, as far as I know, wrote 2 books, and he basically builds on and interprets and projects into the future some of Steiner's ideas about technology. The book I have here is Machines and the Human Spirit. Again, that's Paul Emerson, Machines and the Human Spirit. And this is basically a selection of quotes from Steiner's lectures and writings about the development of technology, and then Emerson adds his own thoughts and, as I say, projects into the future. One of the central ideas is that our technology is, of course, not informed by spirit, and therefore is ultimately destructive. And one of the destructive technology that we've been pursuing, certainly in the 20th and 21st century, but perhaps even back as far as the Industrial Revolution, is what Steiner and Emerson refer to as atomic technology. Now, that doesn't just mean nuclear, but it means all of the fossil fuel based, all of the modern technologies that our industrial civilization is built upon. And it doesn't mean that all of this in every aspect and dimension is somehow, corrupt and destructive, but it is not informed in the right way. It is not informed by spirit. So therefore, ultimately, it's like how can I put it? It's like some kind of Frankenstein's monster, being unleashed, uncontrolled, and at best amoral. And the argument here is that we can develop technologies that are informed by spirit, that actually serve humanity and the planet, and that ultimately, it's interesting here, it sets out ways that humans might be able to interact with machines and technology in a way that's in some aspects reminiscent of transhumanist ideas, not being integrated with machines, but being able to manipulate them and somehow be integrated with them at a psychic level or a psycho-spiritual level. But believe me, this is quite unlike any transhumanist idea. It's not about that at all. With the interesting looking machine on the front here, incidentally, is something built by one of the pioneers of spirit-informed technology, an American guy. I can't remember his name or when this is from, but certainly it's well over 100 years old. Now, Emerson's other book on this topic is a much bigger tome. I don't have a copy, but I wrote down the title because it's quite long. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce one of the words in it. But it is from what I think is from Gondis to Silicon Valley. Spiritual Forces in the Development of Computers and the Future of Technology. Once again, that's Paul Emerson. His books are not that easy to come by, but I found my copy in a Steiner bookshop. So if you find them unavailable at your favourite outlet, then try looking up your local Steiner bookshop. There are quite a few of them out there. The next angle to take on this is on the work of Paul Levy. Now, Levy's been a guest of mine on Legalized Freedom a couple of times, speaking about his basic concept of a mind virus. Okay. His term, well, it's not his term, the term he uses is Watico, which is a Native American term. And Levy's latest book is this one, Watico, Healing the Mind Virus That Plagues Our World. And the idea of some kind of collective insanity is what at the root of all this. The previous book I interviewed him with was entitled, once again, Watico, Breaking the Curse of Evil. You can find that at legalizedfreedom.com. And also a more recent interview I did with him based around the events of the last 2 years. A scheduling conflict has prevented us getting together to discuss this book, but it is on the cards. So that will be happening very soon. And this idea of some kind of force, whether it is ultimately part of us or whether it is truly external, the key idea is that we've been infected at a psycho-spiritual level by something malevolent that is causing our self-destructive behavior, and also the destruction of the biosphere, which ultimately supports us. The nature that we're embedded in, that's causing us to believe ourselves to be separate from that, when of course we're not. And the Native Americans, and indeed other indigenous peoples, had a very clear understanding of Wetiko and the existence of evil, which we, of course, in our postmodern, post-everything society, like to think of as an arcane idea, that bad people do bad things, but the idea of evil, no, that can't be an actual, that can't be an entity, can't take the form of an entity, it can't be a real force in the universe. Well, this writing and others similar call that into existence. And as with what I said at the top of the hour, so the top of the 30 minutes, hopefully, the whole idea here is of forces from beyond 5 senses, beyond 3 dimensions. Something, even if it's within ourselves, is without our everyday consciousness, is beyond it, from where we do not know. And that's what Paul and other writers are endeavoring to discover, and that may be the most important and urgent quest of our age. To another contributor to legalizefreedom.com comes in the shape of Mark Stavish, a very erudite thinker and speaker, and indeed writer, a man with deep knowledge of esoteric and occult topics. And he brings to us the age-old concept of the egregore. And once again, legalizefreedom.com, Mark and I discussing this book, Egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny. And that kind of sums up almost everything I've said up to this point. Mark and I also did a later, more recent interview, once again about the events of the last couple of years, taking that angle on things. So, and this is an invaluable, really, way of thinking about it. Again, I'm here just presenting these resources to you. You're going to have to do some legwork. But essentially, an egregore is like some kind of collective entity. And that kind of, in the so-called real world, that kind of a very simple manifestation in terms of, you look at McDonald's logo or Coca-Cola logo, some of these corporate logos, or look at the logos of mainstream media corporations, or even logos of now the big pharmaceutical corporations. These are representative of egregores. Enough collective energy goes into something, it starts to take on a life of its own. That's just part of the concept here. But yes, the work of Mark Stavish, invaluable in this area, in understanding the events of our times. There was also a very recent interview at Legalize Freedom with a lady called Emma Farrel. And the title of that, incidentally, is War on COVID-19, War on Humanity. And in that, we explore some of these ideas as well from her perspective. And we get into the potential for not just occult forces and non-human entities, but even of, the demonic forces, even off-world, extraterrestrial, interdimensional. There isn't anywhere she doesn't really go in looking for an answer here. And of course, it may be none of the above, or all of the above, or some combination thereof. But that's what we're trying to discover. Now, from all of that, we turn to the world of astrology. And of course, what we're talking about here is not the short column in the tabloid newspaper that says you're going to meet a tall, handsome stranger next week. I think anybody watching this who thinks that probably needs to do a little bit of homework. But yeah, astrology, the idea being that the heavenly bodies in the solar system and the wider cosmos have some kind of effect on and correlation with human affairs, events in human history. Now, I'm not talking about the kinetic effects of astral bodies on the Earth. For example, we know the moon affects the tides on Earth. That's a kinetic effect, not talking about that. But for thousands of years, it's been very well documented by astrologers and also some astronomers that there are patterns of movements, cycles in the heavens that correspond, as I said, to human events, cycles of human affairs. And there's so much correspondence here that to write it off would be foolhardy. So I want to present possibly the Bible in all of this, certainly a masterpiece in this area, by Richard Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche. Unlike a lot of the others, this is not a short book. I'm still making my way through this. Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview. And this really seeks to just turn everything you thought about life, the universe, and everything on its head. It's a completely different way of looking at life on Earth, our existence, the cosmos, meaning and purpose. And interestingly, online you can find a talk. I think it was actually, sort of perhaps a Zoom call or whatever, and it has Richard Tarnas speaking about the events of the last couple of years in the light of his astrological work. So again, it's one way to start thinking, rethinking what's going on, and this can be complementary to everything that's gone before. This isn't an alternative necessarily to any of the other perspectives I've spoken about. This can all become part of a more complex tapestry of pointers, breadcrumbs in a trail, leading us a bit closer to something at least resembling the truth. Another one of my go-to guests, John Michael Greer, go-to on pretty much any subject actually, but particularly the future of industrial civilization or not. He's a guy who's also extremely well versed in mysticism, esoteric and occult matters. He's got a new book just coming out called The Twilight of Pluto, which again is about the waxing and waning of planetary influences. And I'll be speaking to him on that within the next few weeks. But I want to mention it because I know a lot of listeners are fans of Greer. So if you're not already aware, Twilight of Pluto will be coming out very, very soon. And as we begin to draw things for a close today, we jump from astrology to the aforementioned astronomy. And again, another way of thinking about what's happening in the last couple of years is the actual kinetic effects of the planetary bodies beyond Earth, whether in the solar system or the wider galaxy or even beyond, the effects they have on, in our case, life on Earth and in our consciousness of everything on the planet, indeed the consciousness of the planet. One of the most mind-blowing books I've ever read, kind of full stop really, is this one, Lost Star of Myth and Time by Walter Cruttenden. Needless to say, there's a show of the same name, myself and Walter, available at Legalized Freedom. One of the key ideas in here is that our sun actually has a binary twin, which is not visible to us, but in our distant folk memory and mythological past that we have a knowing of. But what I want to present in speaking about astronomy, is the idea that whether it's kinetic movements caused by the movements, kinetic changes on Earth caused by movements of other heavenly bodies, in our case, planets in the solar system, or cosmic rays, radiation, this stuff, which is bombarding Earth constantly, we know it affects human consciousness. We know that it has physical effects, and we know it has mental, psychological effects. And if you map that out across millennia and hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years of life on Earth, then there are some very, very interesting patterns that emerge. And of course, it isn't just that the Earth orbits the sun. Our entire solar system orbits the galactic center. Hundreds of thousands of years, the solar system moves around the galactic center. And in doing that, it passes through different parts of the galaxy where very different conditions prevail. Areas of intense radiation, areas of not such intense radiation, all sorts of conditions apply. And this can be mapped potentially across the rise and fall of civilizations, golden ages, iron ages, dark ages, great cycles of heaven and earth. And the idea of the precession of the equinox comes in here, that the life on earth is not a linear process, but it's cyclical. And that fits in with the idea of these circles and spirals of all the heavenly bodies, our own Earth and solar system included, as they make their way in a great dance of millions, billions, trillions of years around the universe, in our case, this localized area of our own galaxy. So Lost Star of Myth and Time, Walter Cruttenden, that amazing book. I hope he writes something as a follow-up to that at some point. So that's about it for today. Hopefully you'll find something useful in all of that to help you think a little bit differently about what's been happening to us all in the last couple of years. Because one thing's for sure, the telly box, the glowing blue thing in the corner, you will not find the answers there. You mightn't find it in any of what I've just spoken about, but you certainly won't find it in television or in the newspapers or on Facebook. So before I go, I'd like to just say that once again, check out all the shows I mentioned. There's a wealth of material available at legalized-freedom.com covering all these topics. So much more that you can go and explore if you wish. And of course, I'm not the only one covering these topics. If you've enjoyed any of this material, you might like to subscribe to the YouTube channel that you're currently watching, Legalized Freedom 1. Remember to click the little bell to get the updates. That'll be much appreciated. The more subscribers the channel has, the more attention it gets. It's a virtuous circle. And you can also subscribe at legalized-freedom.com if you want to get the complete shows. A lot of the stuff is for free. Some of it is for subscribers. If you're interested, check that out. So until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizedfreedom.com.
legalizedfreedom.com